Welcome to this video on conscience. Before you watch this video, I'd encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to watch my presentation on freedom, because freedom is so important to understanding conscience. The first thing I should say is the obvious, that conscience ultimately is known only to the person, herself or himself. This is something that St. John Paul II notes, that only a person knows their personal response to conscience. And that makes it difficult for us to pass judgment on the conscience of another person, whether it's good or otherwise. All we can do is look to external signs, which may or may not be a sign of what is going on inside a person. So that's always important, that as St. Ignatius says in the Spiritual Exercises, we should always be slow to rush to judgment of another person and their conscience. The second point is to ask, why do we have a conscience? In the Jewish Christian tradition, our concept of conscience comes from our concept of humanity and being made in the image and likeness of God. Now, the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes and St. John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor both take up a text from the book of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, that says, and I quote, "God left human beings in the power of our own counsel." In other words, we have this God-given dignity that we are not made to follow God like robot-type machines or like unintelligent animals. On the contrary, God has dignified us by giving us the ability to find God and God's ways by seeking God and arriving at knowledge of God, His truth and goodness, by our own free choice. That's something which gives us dignity and itself is an expression of our dignity. In other words, conscience is an ability that God has given us so that we can follow God freely. We achieve dignity in moral life not by blindly or unintelligently following God. We don't find dignity by following God because we have to. We don't find dignity in God simply because we respond to God by animal instinct. Rather, with conscience, we have the dignity of making free choices for God, free choices for good, and free choices for the truth. In other words, conscience is a faculty of dignity, and it's a faculty of freedom. But right now, though, I might go to another point that's worth noting, and that is what conscience isn't. Conscience is not about feeling, or it's not about instinct. And a little Latin lesson is going to be helpful here. The Latin root of the English word conscience gives us a hint as to what conscience is. Conscience comes from two Latin words, cum and scientia. The con or the cum in conscience means simply with. The science part comes from scientia, the Latin for knowledge. So con science, conscience, cum scientia, literally means with knowledge. Conscience is about acting with knowledge. It shouldn't be confused with feelings or instincts. Conscience is acting with knowledge. The act of conscience is knowing an object. But what is it? In Vatican II's document Gaudium et Spes, the Council says that within our conscience, we discover a law that God has inscribed in the human heart. It's a law that calls us to do good and avoid evil. We find that in Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 16. In other words, as Vatican II also says, conscience tells us what is right or wrong in the eyes of God. Conscience is, as John Paul II says in Veritatis Splendor, a witness to us of whether we are faithful towards God or not. I'd also add to the Council and to John Paul II that conscience doesn't just tell us what's right or wrong in the eyes of God, but it tells us what is right or wrong according to our own humanity. Now, in the Jewish Christian tradition, those two things are one and the same. What is right or wrong by God is also right or wrong by our humanity. And this is what conscience tells us: what's right according to God, and what's right or in harmony with our human nature. But I mentioned that conscience is about knowledge of the truth. And conscience is not an invention of truth as such, but in the Jewish Christian tradition, it's a discovery of truth. There's a view of conscience that says that it's an invention of our own moral principles. Now, if we're doing that, we're separating our conscience from God and essentially entering into the abuse of freedom I mentioned in the previous video. On the other hand, conscience is about discovering truth and discovering the will of God. Saint Bonaventure has a great way of putting it, that conscience, when it's authentic conscience, is like God's messenger within us, not inventing things for ourselves, but by bearing witness to us within our hearts of the truth and goodness of God. Conscience has therefore been called the voice of God within us, and importantly, this is why conscience has got a binding force. If conscience was just something we invented for ourselves, it wouldn't be so valuable. But because conscience makes known to us God's truth and goodness, then the imperative to follow conscience comes from the imperative to follow God. Another way of putting this, and it is brief, it's short, it's concise, but it says so much. In Veritatis Splendor, paragraph 58, St. John Paul II says this, that conscience is the sacred place where God speaks to a person. Now, something I should note here is that just as with freedom in the wider context, conscience is not at liberty to ignore the truth. I mean, so many times I've heard people come up to me and say, look, I know it was wrong, but my conscience told me to do it. That's not what conscience is. Conscience isn't about ignoring truth and ignoring goodness. It's about knowing truth and acting on it. Conscience is the ability by which we determine and live in the truth for ourselves. And that's because conscience is a witness to God. And because God is truth and goodness, our conscience is not genuine if we're not pursuing what is true and genuinely good.